The big takeaway from our i5-4690K and i7-6700K revisit was that the 4-core 8-thread 6700K is still capable of keeping up with modern games, while the 4-core 4-thread 6600K is showing its age and benefits more from an upgrade. This means that we have to travel even further back in time to find a generation of Intel Core Series CPUs that definitely need to be replaced. Since some of those 6000 series chips are still perfectly fine for simple gaming, today we're shifting our focus to the Haswell refresh, Devil's Canyon, which shipped with an enthusiast overclocking slant. We'll be rebenching the Intel i7-4790K and i5-4690K in stock and overclocked configurations, although owners of the 4770K and 4670K can follow along pretty closely. Before that, this video is brought to you by Linode Cloud Computing. We've trusted Linode as our web host since 2012 and recommend it for excellent technical and customer support, reliable uptime, and a clean interface. Aside from cloud hosting, Linode.com recently added GPU hosting plans for machine learning and neural net use, built with RTX 6000 GPUs and 10 gigabit per second network speeds. They're also starting to deploy EPYC CPUs in their servers. Sign up for Linode.com Cloud Computing with code GNEXUS20 for a $20 credit, or click the link in the description below to visit linode.com/gamersnexus. Haswell was one of Intel's longer-lived generations. It launched in 2013, and it remained in Intel's desktop CPUs with the 2015 Devil's Canyon refresh of Haswell, where you had the, add 20 to the SKUs. 4770 becomes the 4790, and the 4670 became the 4690K. These had a bit of an enthusiast slant more than typically, and actually I remember sitting in the meeting in, I think it was San Francisco just after GTC or something, where Intel was addressing the talking point of improved thermal paste under the IHS versus solder, and what they were planning to do for Devil's Canyon and how it was better thermally and all of that stuff. So that point was still active at that time for the 4000 series. But this remained active all the way through the HEDT only Broadwell generation and all the way up to Skylake's release in 2015. And we already covered the 6000 series with a revisit. If you have one of those chips and want to see how those do today, the i5-4690K and i7-4790K Haswell chips, though, the refresh, were the pinnacle of gaming, just like the 6700K was at the time, and made a lot of sense to buy if you were gaming only. This was also in peak an i5 is enough for gaming season, which we were a part of because it was. An i5 was great for something as simple as GTA 5, which actually came out pretty late towards the end of the 4000 series and around the beginning of the 6000 series, with the 6700K actually getting benchmarked in GTA 5 when we first reviewed it. So all the way up through that time, and even with some of the games that came out afterwards, an i5 was perfectly fine for gaming. Today, that's changed. We don't really recommend them anymore. An R5 3600 would be our cheaper choice for that. So the 4690K, we need to cover some prices, had a launch MSRP of $243. The 4790K had an MSRP of $339 to $350, according to Intel's ARC database. One of the considerations here with these revisits is if you're on an older i5, like a 4690K, can you sell it for more than it's worth? And the answer is, well, based on what's out there, probably yes. And then can you buy a 4790K for more than it's worth? Ideally, just like with owners of the 6600K who might want to get one last push out of their motherboard and their RAM before being forced to upgrade all of it, you would hopefully be able to find something like the i7 variant of your i5 for $50. But that's not really particularly common, unfortunately. So it does make a full upgrade of everything more likely. And for that, we'll be comparing the MSRP of the time versus chips in roughly the same price category today, with some looks at the 9700K at the very high end. But the prices don't line up perfectly. The i5-9600K is about $20 cheaper than the old i5, and the i7-9700K is about $50 more expensive than the old i7. The 9900K is more in the spirit of the 4790K, but it's way more expensive, approaching $500 for that one, and is sort of entering HEDT territory, even though it's not technically. As for AMD, the closest price analogs are the 3600X or the 3600 in the $190 to $210 range now, and the 3700X or 3800X in the $330 to $350-ish range, respectively. Those aren't the Ryzen CPUs we typically recommend, the 3800X that is. We like the 3600 a lot for what it does, and then we kind of like the higher end ones. But they're currently on sale for competitive prices, and that might make them worth considering if you're trying to buy in the same price category as your old i7 purchase was. Let's get into the benchmarks now. We'll focus on gaming stuff for this one. We've got a couple production benchmarks in there, but not as many as normally because, well, frankly, you're probably not running a lot of those workloads on these older CPUs. And if you are, you can look at some of our other recent benchmarks to see production workloads for modern CPUs. So we'll start testing and see how the 4000 series keeps up in basically 2020. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with DirectX 12 is our first game. We'll start with 1080p gaming, but we'll add 1440p shortly. Not that it really matters when you're this CPU bound. The 4790K managed a very playable 107 FPS average in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, including frame times that supported playback without detectable hitches or stuttering. This is a game that was released in the same year as Intel's 9000 series CPUs, making it significantly newer than the era of the Intel 4000 CPUs. Overclocking brought the 4790K to 122 FPS average, a gain of 13% over baseline, and perhaps more importantly, pushed the 0.1% lows above 54 FPS to 63, improving frame time consistency. Its most modern replacement, the more expensive Intel i7-9700K, blows past it without even an overclock, landing at 166 FPS average, while the AMD R5-4690K averaged 144 FPS average, also respectable. Moving to the 9700K grants a considerable improvement in average FPS of about 55%, with the 3800X offering an uplift of about 34%. The stock i5-4690K scored much lower at 73 FPS average, but the 4.6 GHz OC helped with a 26.6% uplift to 93 FPS average. The i5-9600K destroys its older counterpart and almost halves the average frame time, yielding a frame rate of 144 FPS average, with an overclock raising that to 158 FPS average. Tomb Raider greatly benefits from the extra 2 cores on the newer CPU, although we still don't necessarily recommend the 9600K on average. The R5-3600's 138 FPS average yields a stock-to-stock improvement of 88% versus the i5-4690K anyway, although that's reduced to about 51% when overclocking the older i5. Still, AMD is on the map as compared to its lackluster 4000 era offerings, which might as well have not existed, and also got AMD successfully sued into a settlement. The 4690K is getting embarrassed by even the AMD R5 3400G, and the i5-6600K would have granted meaningful uplift as well if you had waited one more generation, but you'd be upgrading still, so it doesn't really matter. Hitman 2 with DirectX 12 is our next title. At 1080p, Hitman 2 averaged 64 FPS average on the 4690K and 95 FPS average on the 4790K. 0.1% lows are always terrible in this test, but the 4690K dipped to an especially unpleasant 18 FPS for the 1% lows. In contrast, Intel's current gen i5-9600K averaged 113 FPS, with 1% lows at 53 FPS, due in no small part to its additional 2 cores and threads. The other modern preferable upgrade for i5 owners would be an R5-3600 or 3600X, which averaged an even higher 115 FPS thanks to additional threads and modern architectures. The 4790K is similarly outclassed by its modern components. The stock R7-3800X averaged 26.5% higher at 120 FPS average, and the stock Intel i7-9700K averaged 48.5% higher at 140 FPS average. Overclocking rarely offers significant benefits in this title, and boosting the 4790K to 4.8 GHz caused a minor 3.1% increase up to 97 FPS average. Overclocking won't fix everything on these Devil's Canyon parts. The 4690K bucked that trend though with a 19.3% uplift, with a 4.6 GHz OC picking up some of the slack from the lacking thread resources, but that's still far behind the stock cores of modern 9000 series chips. The stack is the same at 1440p, but the higher performing CPUs are very clearly GPU bound, which is good news for the older parts. The 9700K is down to 128 FPS average here, which is still 35.6% ahead even when constrained versus the 4790K at the same resolution, but that's a smaller gap than at 1080p. This is a useful reminder that even with the 2080 Ti, games running at 1440p or 4K will frequently be GPU bottlenecked, but also that this doesn't indemnify the slower parts of responsibility. Even running at 1440p doesn't do much for the 4690K. Gaming on a quad-core i5 is absolutely possible. We weren't claiming otherwise we've just reached the point where upgrading from a quad-core i5 will make a massive difference in a lot of titles, or at least a noticeable difference in some of them. F1 2018 is our next benchmark, using settings that won't bottleneck the GPU, as that invalidate most of the comparative data, but it's useful to see sometimes for realism. The Intel i5-4690K leads off with an average of 195 FPS in F1 2018 at 1080p, with the AMD R5 3600 beating it by about 38% at 267 FPS average. Overclocking the i5 brought it up to 219 FPS average, a boost of 12%. F1 is less directly thread dependent than Hitman 2, as witnessed by the even higher 284 FPS average for the stock 6-core 6-thread 9600K. Upgrading within the same price bracket offers significant benefits for the i5 when looking at these parts. If you wanted to buy a same platform used 4790K, although good luck on the pricing, the 228 FPS average stock and 237 FPS average overclock results draw near to the i5 competitors that we just mentioned, but far behind the 302 FPS average of the stock 9700K, which is 33% ahead. Even with the 3800X, you'd average 279 FPS stock, although it's not far behind the 3600's average without the opportunity to fully leverage its 16 threads in this title. At least the 4690K is outperforming the 3400G in this one, though. That was embarrassing previously. As with Hitman 2, raising the resolution to 1440p creates a GPU bottleneck and benefits the CPUs lowest on the stack. It doesn't make the older CPUs any better, it just makes it more likely that they aren't the highest priority for upgrading. The stock 4790K averaged a slightly reduced to 11 FPS, not quite equaled by the overclocked 4690K at 207, while the 9700K hit a wall of GPU limitations and couldn't get past 242. That narrows the 9700K's advantage to 14.7%. It's not really fair to the 9700K from a CPU review standpoint, but in the real world, it's reasonable for people who are GPU limited in games. Total War's battle benchmark is fairly kind to the 4000 series CPUs, and it does become more GPU bound at the top of the chart than some of the other games. This benchmark was also kind to the 6000 series CPUs in our recent Skylake revisit. The biggest problem we encounter in this particular game is stuttering on high core count CPUs, which are eliminated from these charts anyway since they're out of the price range. So these 4 and 8 thread parts are perfectly suited for it. The 4690K averaged 111 FPS stock, but pushed up to 125 FPS when overclocked for a 13% improvement, more than adequate for gaming but outmatched by the stock 9600K at 166 FPS average. The R5 3600, more relevantly, placed at about 159 FPS average stock, or 43% better than the 4690K and near parity with the 9600K. The 4790K pushed further up the stack with a 136 FPS stock average and 142 overclocked, with the 3800X only offering a 15.1% uplift over the OC result, moving to 164 FPS average. The 9700K has become partially GPU limited at 172, but it's a 27% step above the older i7-4790K. The Total War campaign benchmark takes place on the Total War Grand strategy map rather than the battlefield, and it typically shows greater scaling between the CPUs. The FPS averages for the Haswell CPUs weren't much better than those in the battle benchmark, and in fact, the averages for the 3800X, 9700K, and 9600K stuck pretty close to their previous scores as well. The 4690K averaged 116 stock, 132 overclocked, for averages beaten by the stock 9600K at 162 FPS average. The 9600K was capable of overclocking to 5.2 GHz, which benefited it more here, bringing its average far beyond what the older CPUs could achieve at 183 FPS, or about 39% versus the overclocked 4690K for improvement. The R5 3600 ran at 157 FPS average, planting at 35% ahead of the 4690K's 116 FPS average, a marked gain. Even the overclocked 4790K only averaged 135 FPS, allowing the stock 9700K's 176 FPS average a 30 to 33% lead, depending on if you're talking stock or overclocked. It's no surprise that a new CPU in the same price bracket as the old CPU will perform better. The question is whether it's enough better that it's worth upgrading. As for AMD, the R7-3700X placed at 158, or about 20% ahead of the stock 4790K. Assassin's Creed has become one of our favorite game benchmarks for showing scaling up to about 8 threads, and the averages for the 4690K are accordingly terrible. The 4690K scraped by with a 60 FPS average, but with significant noticeable frame time spikes, resulting in 23 FPS for the 0.1% lows. These excursions from the mean are exactly why we introduced the 1% and 0.1% low metrics to benchmarking, and the coining of those terms building on top of Scott Wasson's excellent frame time reporting when he was at Tech Report, because these show what gets averaged out in the average FPS number. Of course, a frame-to-frame interval plot, which we also do sometimes, would show you some further drill down into the data. Overclocking helped significantly with a 24% improvement in average frame rate, but that's still just 74 FPS versus 114 FPS average for the 9600K, which also holds completely playable lows without the stuttering. The 3600 with its 12 threads did even better here, with an overall average of 115 FPS. The 4790K maintained a more playable 85 FPS average, or 91 FPS with an overclock, but the 3800X at 119 FPS average and the 9700K at a vastly superior 139 FPS average are big improvements. Here's the 1440p chart for Assassin's Creed. Of the relevant CPUs, the 9700K is the most heavily affected by GPU bottlenecking here. The 9700K at 124 FPS average is now only, in big air quotes there, 46.6% ahead of the stock 4790K, showing that no, your GPU is not necessarily the only limitation in the system. The rest of the CPUs are more towards the middle of the stack, where they maintain roughly the same CPU-bound frame rates as they did at 1080p. The Civilization 6 turn time benchmark looks at time instead of frame rate as the metric for gaming performance, giving us an interesting look at AI simulation processing. This is another that really benefited from an overclock on the 4690K, not surprising given what we already know of Civ, that it likes frequency, going from 46 seconds per turn on average to 39.1 seconds per turn. For perspective, the 9600K at 34.2 seconds and the 3800X at 33.1 seconds were faster, but the gap is smaller than what we've seen in some of the other tests. This is an average turn time reduction stock to stock of about 28%. The 4790K exactly tied the 4690K at 39.1 seconds, the overclocked 4690K that is, for average turn completion time, and its own overclock of 4.8 GHz cut that down to 36.2 seconds. That's within the realm of modern CPUs and downright competitive with the 3800X's 33.1 second average. The 9700K managed 31.1 seconds, which is close to the top of the chart, and a reduction versus the 4790K stock of 20%. The high thread count CPUs don't have much of a benefit here, and we'd call this result a positive one, at least for the 4790K. GTA 5 should be the most natively suited to these CPUs since it launched in the heyday of the 4-core 4-thread i5s and 4-core 8-thread i7s. The 4690K did manage a stable average frame rate of 78 FPS, with a 0.1% average at nearly 60 FPS, and overclocking boosted the overall average to 88 FPS. Still, the stock 3600X beat the overclocked average by 22% with a 107 FPS result, and the 9600K was even beyond that at 113 FPS. The 4790K averaged just 84 FPS with no huge advantage offered by the extra threads, and climbed to 89 with a 4.8 GHz overclock, so not a big deal. Those numbers are barely beyond the 4690Ks, which makes them even further behind the modern equivalents. That's also why everyone said, quote, an i5 is enough for gaming, including what we said back when we reviewed some of these CPUs, because it was. This makes it pretty obvious that was the state of things at the time. The 9700K in particular averaged 122 FPS, or 45.2% beyond the stock 4790K. The R7-3700X ran at about 109 FPS average, not particularly beneficial over the 3600 in this title. We're moving on to production benchmarking next. We cut our production benchmarks in less than half for these revisits because it's just, well, the data is not as important as in modern HEDT part reviews or anything like that, so we're just going to look at a few core items. Photoshop is first up as the best candidate out of all the production tests to be run on a low core count CPU. The overall score for the 4690K was a predictably low 681 points, while the stock 3600X scored 41.2% higher at 966 points. The stock 9600K wasn't far beyond at 942 points and surpassed it with a 5.1 GHz to 1065 points. The 4790K was more promising with an initial score of 761 that gained to 816 with an overclock, but the 3800X managed 1024 points stock and the 9700K averaged 1043 points stock. Now overall, the 4000 series CPUs are still holding on reasonably well. They're not what you'd call good by today's standards, but they're doing okay. It's just that they are probably starting to suck to use if you do this a lot. The deltas aren't much different from the game tests, but it can only get worse from here for the rest. Note that we were forced to reduce the Uncore OC from 48X to 46X for this, and the Premiere test as well due to stability issues. Adobe Premiere is our next benchmark. The 4690K took 9.5 minutes to render our 1080p show floor video, compared to 5.6 minutes for the 6-core 6-thread 9600K, a CPU that also isn't best suited for this kind of work, but still managed a 41% time reduction. The 6-core 12-thread R5 3600 completed in 4.8 and 4.7 minutes for the OC, a time reduction of 49% versus the 4690K. If you're working in Premiere these days, more than you might have when you bought an i5, the 3600 is a good jump at similar cost to the old chip when you first invested. The 4790K did a little better at 7.4 minutes, or 6.8 with the 4.8 GHz overclock, which isn't wildly worse than the stock 8-core 8-thread 9700K at 4.5 minutes. The 3800X has 16 threads though, and it completed the render in just 3.8 minutes, or about half the time it took the stock 4790K. Now that said, back when you likely bought an i5-4690K or i7-4790K, Adobe Premiere was extremely frequency bound and didn't really know at all what to do with extra threads. So times have changed a lot. The software's been updated. It's much better now. I should walk that back a little bit. Premiere's still terrible in a lot of ways, but at least it uses the hardware better, sort of. The 4K render is next. 31.4 minutes for the 4690K to render the 4K B-roll footage is abysmal, especially considering that this isn't even as intensive as a full real project from us would be. It's about half of a real project. That's massively outperformed by even the stock 9600K at 17.4 minutes, and even more so by the stock 3600 at 14.2 minutes and 32.8 overclocked. Stock to stock, that's a time reduction of 55%. The 4790K did significantly better at 24.1 minutes stock and 22 overclocked, with the 9700K completing in 13.7 minutes. So if you're favoring gaming and you buy a 9700K, because that's mostly what you do, then you still get a massive upgrade in Premiere. The finishing blow, though, comes from the 3800X. So if you are looking to focus on rendering, that finished the video in 11.1 minutes at stock settings. Anyone using 5-year-old desktop gaming CPUs, though, for serious production tasks should upgrade as soon as possible, if not a while ago. Saving the best for last, Blender is a workload that no sane person should be running on the old i5 CPUs. The 4690K took a full 67.6 minutes to render the GN Monkey Head file versus 25 for the R5 3600. The overclocked 4790K completed it in 40 minutes, trying its hardest, versus 18.6 minutes for the stock 3800X. CPUs exist for these workloads in this price range now. Nobody has to do this to themselves. Just stop. But if you're still stuck on those CPUs, it might be best to just CUDA accelerate and do it on the GPUs. That said, it's nice that with the modern Blender versions, you could run them in conjunction more easily than previously. If you're doing animations, though, you could just render half the frames on CPU and half on GPU. Anyway, though, the 4690K completed the GN logo render in 78.3 minutes compared to the 30.8 for the overclocked 3600. The 4790K overclocked struggled through it in 50.2 minutes, but its counterpart, the 3800X, completed it in 22.8 minutes without an overclock. We're nearing the point where any render task big enough to adequately test a modern HEDT CPU is going to take 2 hours to render on our i5s when we do a revisit in the future. Closing all this out, one of the most common questions we've gotten since the inception of the site has always been, should I upgrade? Should I buy or wait? And the answer is not so simple as us just picking one of those two choices. It really comes down to what the owner of the system wants. So the question, should I upgrade, at this point is basically answered with, do you want to? And to answer that, what you need to look at is, for the workloads you're running today, whether that's gaming or something else, let's just say it's gaming for now. If you're running games and you are dissatisfied with the gaming performance, then, well, yeah, I guess upgrade, especially if you can afford it and you are unhappy with the performance of the current system. If you play games and you don't really feel like you're noticing your system as a limitation in any way, then just leave it alone, keep playing on it, and stretch it as long as you can, because it'll save you money and it's less wasteful anyway. You could always do an upgrade for the next generation. We've lost the 4770K. So if you should upgrade, well, the ideal choices would be something like an R5 3600 or 3600X. If you're trying to spend in the $200 range, you do get an actually sometimes massive performance uplift in gaming, which was not true for the first generation of Ryzen CPUs. So that's changed quite a bit in the last 2 years. But the 3600 is a great choice for people trying to spend about the same as your 4690K was originally. And the 9700K would be a big gaming targeted uplift for owners of the 4790K. We're okay kind of with recommending the 9700K. It's not our favorite chip to recommend. The 9900K is much easier to defend in that category. It still feels kind of bad to buy the 9700K with its artificial lockdowns on it, but it is the more linear progression from a 4790K if you are gaming only focused. If you've expanded the things you do on the system, and maybe these days you play around more with Adobe Premiere, or maybe with tile-based rendering, compression, decompression, especially if you do a lot of workloads with dealing with a lot of files that get compressed, decompressed on a regular basis, then Ryzen's a good consideration. If you're gaming only, the 9700K, or at the cheaper end, but still a major performance uplift, would be the 3600. Those are our two primary recommendations for this one. And if you do want more of the production slant with less of the gaming slant these days, but at the original i7 pricing, then something like a 3700X makes sense. We'd say skip the 3800X entirely. It's basically more or less a waste of money. You could push the 3700X if you wanted to a little bit further to get there. So that's the stack. At this point, upgrading the 4690 or 4790K CPUs will have a significant impact on even just gaming performance at the same price categories for each. The advent of Ryzen means it's possible to get massively better CPUs for production at that price point as well. And if you are on a very strict budget, and you can find one, and that's the hard part, a 4790K upgrade from a 4690K would allow you to keep your entire platform. So you'd keep the memory, the motherboard, you could probably leave the video card alone too at this point, and save some money there and just spend on the CPU. Feels kind of bad to spend a lot of money on a used CPU or an old CPU especially, so we'd really want to see it around like the $50 US range. Maybe you could stretch to 70, but that does feel really bad to spend on chips that old. But it would potentially save you money on the rest of the system. So it just depends on your financial situation for that. But that's a worthwhile option to look into. Maybe you could sell a 4690K and put that money, because you'd probably be ripping them off too, you'd put that money towards getting ripped off on a 4790K, because that's just how the used market is, unfortunately. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more, and go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by picking up things like our mod mats, which are back in stock and shipping now, by the way, in both the large and medium sizes. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for some bonus behind-the-scenes episodes. We'll see you all next time.